Vivica Craig from Virginia Tech in the United States. I was just curious with the People's Health Movement if some of your accountability strategies may include praising, naming, and shaming, which can be very powerful, particularly when social media is used to identify those players who are doing a good job and those who aren't. That's my first point. Second, related to the sugar recommendation, which I know has been very political football for the last 10 years since WHO came out with their first recommendation. I just wanted to make a point of clarification that actually highlighting some of the wins and where actually WHO's norm-setting responsibilities have actually translated at the local or the national level are really quite good. So for example, the sugar, this is the first time in the latest rounds of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans that just came out in 2015 that the percentage of calories from added sugar is less than 10% of energy, but also it's the first time also it's been translated into the labeling, so the update on food labels will show added sugar so people can actually see what's in their food supply. So I think it's good to acknowledge the challenges, but also where the translation is happening and use that as leverage to say, well, if they can do a sugar-sweetened beverage tax in Mexico, they can do it in other countries too.
Thank you. And I'll just repeat that. Thank you very much. It's a question about whether the People's Health Assembly engages in blaming, naming and shaming, and also in the converse of that, of praising, thank you, praising. If you'd like to comment on that or leave that for discussion. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, I think just me personally, I can sound quite critical, but yeah, we do. So when we're making our statements to the board, we do it's like a compliment sandwich. Like, what do we think is good about this? What do we want to praise WHO? What are the issues that we think can be addressed and the key norms that we'd like to see, and then again we have something positive to say. Yeah, so it's probably just me that I sometimes sound quite critical.
Thank you. I like that metaphor too, the compliment sandwich. Thank you. It sounds like me marking hundreds of first-year student essays. I've developed it to a fine art. Thanks very much, Bill.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me as a commentator or a discussant at this very important panel. I would like to bring in a national and a community perspective into the discussion. Now, I come from Sri Lanka and I represent a grassroots movement called the Sarvodaya Movement, which is a development organization. And also since 2000, I have been an active member of the People's Health Movement, bringing together not just developmental organizations in Sri Lanka, but also trade unions and other actors who are very concerned about the health of the larger segment of people who are low-income groups and who are engaged in production and so many different fields in the country. So when you look at governance, and particularly from a perspective of linking governance to WHO governance or health governance, I think what David said at the beginning is very important, that is the global governance starts at the national level. So we have a democratic government, and we also have the presence of international agencies such as the agencies representing the UN system and also the multilateral agencies such as the World Bank, the IMF, and other international and national NGOs. Now, in the context of Sri Lanka, though we have achieved a status of good health at a very low income and demonstrated some achievements in various sectors, including eliminating malaria last year. By last year, we were announced that we are a malaria-free country. So we have had many achievements, but we also have tremendous challenges. And in that context, I just come from a consultation by the WHO to plan their next 5-year cycle. So my first comment is that WHO is still an important player and a positive player, and we need to engage with the WHO and need to somehow help in the reform process. Why? Because WHO still, as David also emphasized, got a lot of technical expertise, and not only the technical expertise and the commitment of the staff at regional and country levels, WHO also has a very strong convening power. This particular planning meeting that I attended was attended by all the top government officials as well as key individuals representing the academia and few of us from the civil society. Now, if we can really harness that positive, that strong convening power of the WHO in the right direction, I think we can make a big impact at the national policy level. So, of course, the counterpart to the WHO at national level is the Ministry of Health, not non-governmental organizations. Using this platform where we are invited to take part in planning processes, I see a great opportunity to put our own perspectives, particularly those coming from our own experience working at grassroots level, at the policy agenda. For example, I was very encouraged to note that the WHO's initial sort of very first strategy had been coined under the theme community empowerment. This is the first time that I have seen for the last 25 years community empowerment being put at the center in a strategy. So I was very encouraged by it. However, my second point is, of course, I mean, having emphasized the fact that at national level engagement and the convening power of WHO need to be positively used, my second point is how do we then engage with the neoliberal model that's operating at country level, which has a very close nexus to the health sector. Now, even the disease control programs where we depend largely on donated medicines as well as supplies, there is a lot of corruption, and we have had our own share of problems when we try to forge partnerships, and these industries are very strong. The People's Health Movement has been lobbying to have the legislation on control of medicinal drugs, and it took us 17 years to bring in a legislation to control the price of drugs. But it happened, but it took a long time, and we had to face a lot of obstacles, challenges coming from the pharmaceutical sector. Also, when you take an example like control of tobacco, we were fighting to get pictorial warnings in the cigarette pack. Ultimately, we had to go to courts because the industry went to courts and got an injunction because we wanted the pictorial message to be 80% of the size of the pack, but they had to compromise and then bring it down to 60%. And even that photograph was not anything to do with cancer, although the caption says that it causes cancer. It was a beautiful photograph of a 5-star hospital bed. So it's very funny. So it's the way that how you try to change the public mind. I think the most challenging thing for us is really how this neoliberal economic model is also conditioning the minds of the people, of the patients. They are also demanding something that the private sector wants to push. So the media is controlled by the same industry. They have shareholdings in those private media. So we are really fighting against a very dominant, strong economic force while trying to work on policies with partners like WHO. Then my third point is, nevertheless, WHO provides a platform not just at national level but also at regional level. There are a lot of regional interactions that are happening. Unfortunately, we all know that there are regional politics that's affecting particularly the South Asian region. So even in the election of the director of WHO for the region, there's a lot of politics involved. How countries vote depends on larger political interests rather than what is really best for the region in terms of improving people's health. So because WHO provides such a good regional platform, I think we need to really exploit that because we don't have any other platforms for health, so we need to preserve that and do the lobbying. My last point is how to hold institutions accountable, including our own ministries of health and other providers of health. We have a legislation in Sri Lanka to control or regulate the private sector, but the implementation is very weak. Therefore, people are being exploited. There is no cap on the charges, hospital charges to doctors' charges, and the amount of time that a specialist should spend with a patient. So there is a problem of accountability there. So recently we have had, after a lot of lobbying, getting the government to agree and enter into partnerships like the Open Government Partnership, OGP, which the government has signed into and committed that it will deliver in certain areas an open form of government where information regarding provision of services, the quality of services, as well as other aspects that matter to the citizen will be disclosed, and the institutions will be made accountable. And we have had now for the first time got introduced a health performance or quality assurance framework for the healthcare system, which is a very encouraging sign, and the proposal actually came from within the Ministry of Health, and we are very encouraged to see that there are champions within the system, because without having champions within the system, we can't change the systems. So secondly, we also have a government commitment to provide affordable and quality medicinal quality drugs, and that is also a very encouraging sign. And also we have a serious public health problem called the chronic kidney disease of unknown etiology, which is suspected to be a result of heavy use of agrochemicals in agriculture. So these three areas have been identified by the government, and this is a very good platform for us to engage, and the WHO is also very much involved in this. So let me conclude by saying that World Health Organization is still a very important actor for us in the developing world, and we need to make it work, and all our effort should be to really make alliances with positive partners and also counteract and oppose those forces which are really against people's health, and that's what we are doing through our own organization, Sarvodaya, and the People's Health Movement. Thank you.
So I want to do two things. I want to comment critically on the three papers that were presented, and then I want to talk about the underused and unexploited potential of the World Federation of Public Health Associations, and actually ask the People's Health Movement to join the World Federation of Public Health Associations as an organizational member. So firstly, just to start with Ron Labonte's paper, which was a very lucid and interesting outline, Ron, of the distinctions on health and governance, on global health governance, and then governance for global health. And even across the panel, I found that both Belinda and David had spoken more on the narrow form of global health governance in relation to WHO rather than the broader issue of governance for global health. However, I would have liked to see more in your presentation that at heart of the challenge that we have, whether it's with the new liberal economic system or with some of the problems that WHO faced, is the problem of unequal power relationships. And those unequal power relationships play themselves out in a number of different ways. It's both between and among countries, and sometimes even within countries. I also would have liked to see more in all the presentations that we've skirted around the problem of inequity. We referred to, David talked about economic inequalities, but inequity is not the same as inequalities. Inequity has a distinct social justice component, and one of the consequences of the dependence of WHO on donor funding is that I think it's lost its overall leadership capacity, David, to actually provide stewardship that would allow us to achieve a greater equity and social justice, and would also allow us to take a more human rights perspective on some of the health issues. So you referred to Ebola, but there have been other instances where WHO has also been, where there's been suboptimal leadership. So for example, around the migrant crisis, xenophobia, and the sort of othering of people who happen to differ, whether it's across, whether it's by ethnic group, by country, by religion, and the list goes on. So I think I would like to see that when we talk about governance, global governance and health, which would allow us to begin to address some of the social, political, and economic factors, and as well as the environmental factors, that we also look at be careful that some of the actions that we take don't exacerbate existing inequalities, whether it's around axes of gender, of race, of geographical region, because often we suffer from I'm from sub-Saharan Africa, and so, I see myself as a proudly African woman. We often suffer the consequences of that. And just, Stephanie, as a matter of interest, I hate with a passion the word developing, because I don't know what developing in relation to what, it refers to. So I actually prefer different terminology, that recognize that, that some of these distinctions are artificial, and even perhaps the contested definition of by, level of income of the country, which we know, that's also skewed, is somewhat better, than referring to developed, because I often wonder, what are we developing into, or what are we developing for? So just to conclude on the papers, so I think we need to also, I would like to see a greater exposition of how the benefits sometimes and the strengths and achievements are unequally distributed. Again, whether it's by, if you use axes of geographical region, the global south versus the global north, whether it's by, by gender, religion, sexual orientation, the list goes off. And then maybe just the last comment, I was interested, David, in why you talked about WHO reform, which is maybe a modest version of perhaps what's needed, as opposed to radical transformation of WHO. So I would like you to comment on. On that. And then I want to move on to, I guess, making a bid or a punt for the World Federation of Public Health Associations. So many people don't know that it was established 50 years ago. In fact, at this conference, the reason why we moved it from 2018 to 2017 is to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the World Federation. Among its, we've developed some outline of what's been some of its milestones, but it certainly participated in the historic Alma Ata conference and was quite instrumental in putting together the Alma Ata declaration. The other potential lever is that in 1971, the Federation was actually recognized as the official NGO that represents a voice on public health at a global level. So that's an opportunity that I think we need to grab on. So currently the Federation has just over 100 members. 82 of those are national public health associations, and the remainder are regional structures, such as the sort of older ones, such as the European Public Health Association, and the more recent, more recent one is the Alliance for Public Health Associations in the Americas. But we also have an African structure, and those certainly are resources that I think the People's Health Movement, it seems to me, Belinda, that a lot of the things that you would talk about could actually be strengthened through coalitions with like-minded organizations. And I would like to suggest that certainly the Federation has got not only potential, but 50 years of wisdom and strengths that could actually contribute to that coalition. As we know, and as we've heard from many speakers this morning, is that advocacy, particularly advocacy for health equity, for social justice, requires us to work at it constantly. We need to continue to chip away, deal with those vested interests, whether it's from the tobacco industry, but also some of the less obvious ones. So the Federation has got a 50-year history. It has national public health associations. There are its core members, because that's what it's a federation for, and I would like to appeal that we need to actually work together to strengthen one another, so that people would join their National Public Health Association and would contribute. I also think that perhaps one of the things that we underestimate is the value of enhancing the discourse. So I don't think there's sufficient numbers of people that have engaged with the issue of why is it important for us to protect a democratically established, I'll be very careful in my selection of words, institution at a global level like WHO, which is really at the core of your presentation, David, is to say, well, you know, how do we actually transform WHO so that it works for us? You know, so that it's actually what Prof. Dorp said earlier in the level lecture, that, you know, advocacy around a particular issue is not a spectator sport. You have to get actively involved, and you actually have to try and make you know, a difference. So I want to appeal that the People's Health Movement actually joins the Federation as a member organization, join hands, and that individuals join their National Public Health Association if they're not already a member of, and that we work to protect democratically established institutions against a much bigger enemy that we continue to face, and that's becoming more sophisticated and certainly have a lot more resources than we have to tackle some of these critical problems. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you for a very inspiring panel. It's inspiring to see such a politically active discussion at the conference, and also obviously for the panel today. I'm Emma Quinn. I'm an epidemiologist for Sydney Local Health District, and I asked this question on behalf of some of my colleagues. But I'm interested really in what you think the strategy and the impact of global governance for health, or global health governance, or however we would like to take that definition, in a sort of post-truth era of Trump. And I give two examples. One is that he actively denies climate change, and I have just recently learnt that he's actually taken funding away from the UNFPA. So in an era where, in an era where opinion seems to outweigh science, how do we engage in that debate and actually make our science heard in a way that is just going to generate some kind of impact for global health?
Thank you. How do we make our voices heard when opinion seems to be trumping facts? Who'd like to comment on that?
Collect a few comments and then we'll...
Collect a few questions. Thanks, Emily. Yes? And we'll take a few questions before the panel addresses them. Thank you.
I'm Bibi Loff from nowhere, really, given that Trump has actually taken away my funding. I sort of sit in a room like this, continually frustrated, thinking that health is playing in the sand pits, and we don't sort of learn from the practices of the forces that end up succeeding. So that when Pfizer was advising the US government about the establishment of patent agreement within the WTO so that there would be an enforcement mechanism, and they succeeded with that. They got their completely unnecessary enforcement mechanism. We don't sort of think about our own capacity to gain enforcement mechanisms in the venues that count. We are there providing shadow advice. We don't have our watch lists. We don't have enforcement mechanisms. And the guidance that we get from social determinants for health don't actually provide any direction to government, we sort of know the general areas that we need to look at, but we don't know what we have to do with them, and we don't know how we have to govern them. So I sort of feel like coalitions and are needed with people way beyond health who work in those disparate areas of enforcement so that we actually get a bit of power, which we really don't have when we are confined to providing shadow advice and when we sit outside the mechanisms of power.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's difficult to summarise such a brilliant question, but I think you're drawing our attention to the limitations of the shadow advice and advocacy and the emphasising of getting involved. Shall we take a couple more comments or?
Yeah, why not?
Yes, yes. Yes, please, and yes.
Yeah, my name's Joe Wright. I work in the Northern Territory but live in Melbourne at the moment. The question I had was really about clarification of the People's Health Movement's approach, whether or not you see yourselves as being a force for providing alternative facts either to the main media or the usual media or the new media, and whether you see yourself as being successful in that space. Because most of your talk, Belinda, which I found very interesting, was really concentrating on external factors, whereas I think there's the potential for a huge role to be played internally.
Thank you. Clarifying the role of the People's Health Movement vis-à-vis alternative facts. Thank you. And yes, another question or comment.
Hi, I'm Paul Freeman. I'm with the Department of Global Health, University of Washington, Seattle. Just presented on a big study we've done recently on which we've been doing over the last 10 years on the evidence base for community-based primary health care. I think it's important that we think about how health care is delivered. Community-oriented, focused on the community, versus on the practitioner, as in the private practitioner in the US and other developing countries. And particularly when we're talking about the World Federation of Public Health Associations and the People's Health Movement, I'd like the WFPHA to think about whether or not they should actually endorse a community-oriented approach to primary health care. Thanks.
Thank you. From the USA, a question of whether the People's Health Movement should endorse a community-oriented approach to primary health care. World Federation of Public Health Associations. Thank you. And is that Samantha?
Yes, it
Samantha
is.
Battams, yes.
Yes, Samantha Battams. I work for Health Outcomes International, but I previously worked in Geneva. And in some previous research I did, there was commentary about the WHO not taking action on issues and not showing leadership because they didn't want to put member states offside, say in relation to trade and health issues. And the other commentary was about some nation states, ministers of health being not so interested in international health because their constituencies weren't interested. For example, Australia, and now we've got really low rates of our funding going to international development assistance. So it seems to me a real challenge is to get, that grassroots interest within countries in terms of international health, and I just wondered if we could maybe discuss that, because that is really going to drive, what happens also at an international level. So, how we can build links across countries in terms of international civil society, I think will be important for global health governance.
Thank you. Thank you. I have two questions about how to strengthen the arm of health ministers and also grassroots movements in civil societies to further strengthen the arms of health ministers. So who'd like to start? Ron, thank you.
I guess we'll go in order along the table.
Thank you.
Boy, that's a huge bunch of very important questions. The first one about what do we do in the post-Trump era? We talk a lot about making our voices count more or holding our governments to account. That partly depends on the fact that we think we have governments that really matter about what's counted, or for that matter, even know how to count, which is by way of saying, I think the simplest way of dealing with our political situation in a post-Trump era, recognize that, okay, it's the US, so we have to pay some attention to it, but really ignore the Trump and the tweets. One of the things is always position these issues as issues of the US Republican Party. Don't make it about Donald Trump, make it about the US Republican Party. And then if the US wants to isolate itself around these issues, let them build coalitions across other countries and across other networks. What to do, that intriguing one, what direction do we actually ask of governments, given that we have these normative things around the social determinants of health, the Sustainable Development Goals, of which will be quite critical tomorrow, but in a hopeful sort of way. Some of the things we know is essentially national governments have given away and need to retake their space for taxation, progressive forms of taxation, social investment, social protection measures. If we can begin to do that within our nation states, and we can begin to look at alternative forms of global taxation for a global redistributive system, that's a very tangible thing that could be done. I mean, that's a very plausible ask of governments. The other is to be wary of corporate social responsibility or voluntary measures, because if they're voluntary, then you have some sectors free riding on the supposed good behavior of another part of that same economic sector. Regulations level the playing field and make it a bit fairer for the people who are playing on that playing field. In terms of community-oriented primary health care, I thought that we probably actually answered that question 30 or 40 years ago. We may be revisiting it in some countries, but basically, absolutely, community-oriented primary health care. I think the direction is very much moving towards that. The challenge we face at a global scale is the consistent sort of pressures on the part of investors and the interests of capital accumulation to make more and more of the health services, even under a model of community-oriented primary health care, to make more and more of those services public-private partnerships that give returns to investors. Rockefeller Foundation now with their social investment scheme, which is essentially, let's tap hedge funds, let's tap private investors, let's maybe perhaps even tap public pension funds, but have them put that into public-private partnerships for these sorts of services in low-income countries on the basis that it's going to do some good, but also it's going to yield much healthier returns than they could get anywhere else. Finally, in terms of the WHO and trade and health agreements, not kind of pissing off the member states, I think I'm going to let David answer that.
David, thank you. Thank you, Ron.
I think those were very thoughtful questions, and some of them are really contributions to discussion rather than questions. There's different levels and ways in which you can get involved in social change, political change. And one way is through policy development, policy analysis, policy development and policy advocacy. Another way, and they're not mutually exclusive, is about building a political constituency for change, which can have the power to demand change. And I'm really responding to the lady from the trade unions in New Zealand, the comment about radical transformation. A lot of the questions get to what is your theory of political engagement. And as a social movement, the theory of political engagement driving the People's Health Movement is about building that constituency. And it's about crossing the boundaries of otherness. It's about building convergence. I'm very impressed by the work of William Robinson in the US, who's a political sociologist who talks about the contradiction between the rise of the transnationals and the fall of the nation state as being a false dichotomy, because what's really happening is the rise of the transnational capitalist class. and the rise of the global elite. And in the context of a rise of the global elite, we see a very well-organised, self-aware, coherent, well-communicated class facing the dispersed middle classes, the dispersed working classes, dispersed, excluded and marginalised groups of people, billions of people. And so in that context, the People's Health Movement sees itself as trying to contribute to a convergence of those kinds of constituencies that will say thus far no further. And the reason I'm elaborating on this in the era of Trump is that what we're seeing is the potential exploitation of people's insecurity to achieve the xenophobia and the parochialism and the tribalism, which fragments rather than brings together. So I'm also responding a bit to Bibi Loft's question about real power. How do you, stop playing in the sandpit? I hope the idea of a convergent social movement, building solidarity, building understanding through dialogue, through collaboration, it's not the whole story, of course it's not, but it's a very important part of it, and that's where we are putting our emphasis. I'd like to pick up specifically an issue that Letitia raised, which was about why do you play in the sandpit of WHO reform instead of going for radical transformation? I've got a very good reason for that. If we opened up WHO to radical transformation, we'd never get anything nearly as positive. The first thing that would go would be the member state specific nature of it. The second thing which would go would be any capacity for treaty making. It's the treaty making powers and the regulatory powers. So in the context of and in the present neoliberal ascendancy, I think we would get the kind of multi-stakeholder partnership which Nestlé is so keen to see in place. The lady from Nestlé said to me, we don't want to run the world, we just want a seat at the table. And that's, as we heard this morning, a seat at the table means advance warning about what's coming so that you can challenge it in the courts, you can challenge it in public relations. So it's a very pragmatic answer. I think we'd lose more by going down that path. In terms of PHM joining World Federation, we would love to. Great. We'll speak about that later. But in terms of balancing the sort of corporate lobbying at WHO and at other international organisations versus and the challenge to preserving the idea of should we be preserving the nation-state hegemony in WHO? There are some trade unions, international trade unions, which are very active in WHO. Public Service International works very closely with the People's Health Movement, and the New Zealand Trade Union Council would be most welcome. We'd love to talk with you about building closer relationships between the unions in all countries, and a people's movement for health. The so-called social unionism would be, it would be terrific. As a member,
This is another group that's really powerful in terms of working with us.
yeah, another group which we are working with is the South Centre. The South Centre is an intergovernmental organisation based in the low and middle income countries, and is a powerful policy commentator. And PHM has been very close with we work with them in developing our commentary on the WHO. So we're unashamedly working to change those power relations between the high income rich countries who are, in our view, holding back both global governance for health and global health governance. I don't know if I've missed everything, but maybe.
Thank you. Yes, thanks, David. Belle.
I just want to say, if anyone's a member of the Public Health Association of Australia, we have a political economy of health special interest group that I would encourage you to join. So, Emily, to your point on Trump, on Sunday, we sat around in a workshop and we talked about Trump and what we were going to do. And it was a lot of fun, to be honest, to get together when you're feeling quite anxious about how it's going to affect you in the future. And I think that the point on solidarity came up a lot, and just reflecting on the work that I'm doing in the trade space. So Australia is currently negotiating a trade agreement in Asia Pacific, and we're quite concerned about some of the impacts for health in the agreement. And in July we had a network, a sort of civil society movement, 2-day workshop in Malaysia, and we tried to bring in groups from all types of sectors. So people who are working on access to medicines, health, seed farmers' rights, trade unions, development organisations, with like a heavy focus on representatives in the lower middle income countries and not from Australia and New Zealand. So that was our attempt to sort of bring in solidarity and share our evidence and our facts, so that when we go back to our countries and we try and write submissions on behalf of our public health associations about the trade agreements, that we have all of the evidence and that we can network with each other. And the point on grassroots development, I think that that's what WHO Watch, I guess, is trying to do. We're trying to use our project to promote more awareness around international health. And we also have some courses, you didn't mention, David, International People's Health University, where we're trying to get people more interested in international health. And my only reflection is that if anyone here is developing public health courses, that including a unit on international health and global health would be really useful in terms of raising awareness of young people, so they go on into their careers about the dynamics of international health.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. And Vinya or Letitia, yes, please.
I just want to comment, there was a specific question that Paul, where are you, Paul? Freeman asked. So I'm going to comment and then just put a rhetorical question to you, which we can discuss over tea. So Paul is very involved in the in APHA, which is a member organization of the Federation, and he's also very involved in the Esperian Foundation, which distributes materials that were developed many, many years ago by David Werner, that some of the young members in the audience won't know. But he revolutionized certainly the whole area around community participation, and there were even indicators about how you would measure community participation. So, Paul, I would say the Federation has already endorsed the Alma Ata Declaration. And I think our challenge is to remind people what the original declaration was about. We often say in South Africa, to explain to people who are not aware of the Alma Ata Declaration, is that it's like the 3 legs of a 3-legged pot, which is very common which you can use on an open fire. So one of the legs of the pot is on community participation. A second one is intersectoral collaboration, which deals with those. Even in 1978, the Alma Ata Declaration was very clear on the importance of addressing the social determinants of health through intersectoral action. And then the third leg of the pot is around the provision of essential health services. And so those 3 together, my sense is that people often choose the one leg which deals with the provision of essential care and makes it a very narrow definition of primary health care. So that would be my response to you about so I don't think there's a need for the Federation to endorse it, because it's already there in all our declarations. Rather, we need to perhaps open that discussion again about the true meaning of primary health care.
Thank you. And we're going to encourage more questions, comments, challenges from the floor, please. And Ron, please, if you've got some more to add.
Sure.
Thank you.
A few things. One of them that was a point Letitia made during her first presentation, in terms of a bit of the hopefulness about what we do right now, is to remember or to recall the power of discourse, the power of ideas, the power of putting forward alternative possibilities. The SDGs, which I will be critical of, nonetheless present in some ways an alternative vision of how we might like the world to be. While we're waiting for the next kind of crisis or sort of collapse within our pathological destructive system right now, we need to continue to nurture what that playbook of an alternative way of being in the world would look like. A small plug here around back into the primary health care, a project that I co-led with David Saunders a few years ago with the People's Health Movement was about revitalizing primary health care or revitalizing health for all. We finally are going to be, in June, the book's going to be coming out, which has a number of case studies from a number of different countries that participated in that international project. And finally, this issue about kind of out-trumping Trump. Apart from the fact that his own party is now really quite concerned about how to sort of silence the beast. I live in Canada. One of the things you've got to know about Canada is, unlike Australia, which I spend a lot of time in, here you hover around the coastline in search of the perfect wave, and in Canada we hover around the 49th parallel in search of lower heating costs. Of necessity, we have a very close relationship right across the border with the United States. Since Trump, there's been a 15 to 40% increase in US students applying to study universities in Canada. There's been up to a 20% cancellation in planned trips and vacations in the United States, trips that had already been paid for. The Girl Guides of Canada announced that it was going to no longer have any kind of cross-border travel to its sister organizations in the United States. And the Toronto School Board, which is the largest school board in the country, very close to the United States, announced until further notice, no student trips, no teacher trips, no conferences, no staff events to the United States. So there's a way in which we're in Canada trying to take a look at this and sort of say, well, we'll just sort of close off our relationships with them until now. And it's going to be up to the Americans within those borders to essentially realize the falseness that they've been sold during the election and to start to do something about it themselves.
So you're building a wall.
Oh, but we're so 21st century. It's a virtual wall.
A virtual wall. Thank you. Thanks. It's fancy having your finger on those facts. That's fantastic. Thank you. Yes, if you'd like to elaborate further, and then a question here and then here, yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow on. I mean, yes, alma mater, etc. But the big thing now, and then totally ignored, yes, community-based and oriented, no funding, insufficient funding, a focus on funding, still on professional groups rather than on the community. Implementation. We did all this study to establish all the evidence, okay? And still, got to have the evidence. What needs to happen now is to move to the implementation and the different approaches to how to get the people involved. The evidence is these MNCH, for example, delivered within the community, not the health centre, not the hospital, will have the most effect. So it's not old hat. The story goes on and on. Yes, we must spend more money on health professionals. Health professionals must continue, yet health professionals continue with the, shall I call it, behavioural economic approach that communities can't do it. So what's happening is, yes, alma mater, but alma mater is not being implemented, and we have the resources to implement it, and people's health at this level will not continue to improve. We've got over 1 billion people, including 150 million children, living in the slums of the world. Too hard to deal with. But unless we deal with that health at that sort of level, it's going to be ripe for people like Al-Qaeda, etc. You know? Trump, I won't comment in detail on Trump, but you know, to me, it's not over. It's barely started.
Thank you. So we'll take these 4 questions, comments in a row. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Toabech Bishau from the African Federation of Public Health Associations. I want to raise a few points on why I think we are where we are now. Yes, we have gone through the Alma-Ata period when Alma-Ata was a result of case studies in different countries of the world, like Cuba, where they have successfully delivered health services to their people. And based on that, the principle of community participation, people-centered leadership were critical elements. And then the world declared Alma-Ata as a way and as a strategy to achieve health for all. But that didn't happen because some interest groups, again, moved it away from the initial principle of Alma-Ata and the goal it has set itself to achieve health for all. But we knew what needed to be done. And there is, health professionals are key players in this endeavor. And professionals are important. Professionals are necessary to work with the communities. We shouldn't romanticize communities as answering all the questions that negatively affect their lives. So, but what kind of professionals do we need? We need professionals with integrity. We need professionals that are sincerely committed to addressing the problems of the people that they serve. But this we didn't do, and that has not been done, okay? And during the, after Alma-Ata, assessments were made. We thought we had pinpointed the issues that didn't help us achieve the Alma-Ata goals, and then the Millennium Development Goals were carved globally. The Millennium Development Goals brought in the aspects of resources collectively mobilized to strengthen countries so that those countries will be enabled to do what they intended or what they wanted to do at their communities within their own leadership. But those how many of those countries that could afford to make resources available to the developing countries, sorry Letitia for using this word, to be able to achieve those goals? In fact, the commitment was, yes, community participation, yes, intersectoral collaboration, yes, all these other things, but also commitment of whatever percent of the GDP of those countries to be made available to developing countries so that they are enabled to do what they wanted, what they needed to do. That was not done. And then...
Thank you. I want to give time for the other questions
okay,
too.
let me...
And thank you for emphasizing the importance of budget commitments and surveillance of budget commitments
because,
too.
you know, we should, when we look at the issues, we need to look at the issues in their entirety, because sometimes we pull this one leg and then the other leg is forgotten, then we put another leg. But the whole world, the society, the community, the household is a comprehensive and a holistic setting. So we need to look at in that sense. So we need accountability. We need who is accountable for who? We made these commitments. We are making commitments again in this platform. Then who will hold us responsible to ensure that whatever we're saying is done. So we need to think beyond what we are thinking about now, so that there is some sort of a global accountability, a system for global accountability.
Thank you.
Instead of just romanticizing some of the things that we come
Thank
up
you.
with.
And
Yes,
here and here, thank you.
yes,
Global accountability.
John Esford, Sydney Local Health District, previously worked for the New Zealand Ministry of Health and went to WHA as a government representative for Committee B. It's in that I want to make a comment. A previous speaker spoke about perhaps some weaknesses in the membership of our Global Alliance in terms of skill mix. And I'm reflecting on the many colleagues that I had in Foreign Affairs, in Parliamentary Council, and in Food and Drug Regulation, areas that perhaps don't come to these conferences. And maybe there are some retired DFAT type people, Parliamentary Council type people, or Food and Drug Administration type people who have got the skills and competencies and knowledge about how Committee B works and therefore how they can lend their skills to our global movement, because I think that might be a skill, a knowledge base that's actually missing amongst here today, because I agree with comments made by Ron and others about the importance of the regulatory powers of WHO and the treaty powers of WHO, and those skills need to be amongst our fraternity, I think.
Thank you. Great suggestion. Thank you. And yes, one more final question or comment. Great suggestion to bring in our expert friends and colleagues from other sectors to work with us. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Celia McMichael from the School of Geography at the University of Melbourne. I just had a question about how to better include populations that aren't necessarily well represented by member states, and that's migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, people that cross borders without documentation. So the language of, say, global health governance, health for all, universal health coverage, it implies that everyone is included, but often there are populations such as these that get excluded and aren't well represented.
Really well made points. So thank you about, stateless people. Thank you, very well put. Any final comments from the panel or from the discussants? Thank you. And thank you everyone for your thoughtful input.
Really quickly on a couple of points. The first is that around the Alma Ata, unfortunately Alma Ata got hijacked by neoliberalism and its response to one of the episodic crises in global capitalism. So what we have to do is we have to re-hijack it back, which I think a lot of us have been struggling to do, being aware of some of the forces that we're having to contend with. In terms of the excluded voices, that's a very important point. The limited knowledge I have around that is that there are different smaller NGOs and smaller services that are working around the margins of the undocumented refugees, the people who are really essentially borderless, like Rohingya, for example, in the Asian district. They're the ones that in some ways need to be able to pull out what some of those voices are and to be able to present them when the people who are essentially silenced and not able to come forward can't speak for themselves. So they need to have some spokespeople. I know that there's been a project that Peter knows about, Peter Hill, about the Go for Health was an attempt to try to do that at one point. So other ways of trying to sort of bring those voices into international or public or governance forums.
Thank you.
Just very quickly, a couple of things hanging over me. One is that Joe Wright asked about external and internal, and where are you, Joe? I just wanted to make the point that PHM in Australia does have a number of connections and alliances and groups which are part of it or which have affiliations with it, one of which is AMSANT in the Northern Territory, which is a valued member of PHM and is doing kind of PHM-y work in the context of the Northern Territory. So, but the idea that Belle was talking about, which was about trying to find ways of linking the global and the local, is very much part of what we're trying to do. leave it at that.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Belle.
Just in response to the rep from the African Public Health Associations, I think that's a really good point around accountability. And I'm thinking about us, the health community in Australia, and how we're going to monitor Australia's commitments on the SDGs and how we're going to hold them to account when they may likely not fulfill some of the commitments, in particular around financial contributions to other states. So how do we build a movement amongst us and bring the public health voice? Because I know the groups like Get Up are quite good, but public health also has in a way we have this expertise or seen as an authoritative voice in the media and in the community, and public health, people listen. So there's an opportunity to be more vocal and track Australia's obligations on the SDGs going forward.
Thank you. And it's something we need to address further is how to really harness the skills of the younger generation around multimedia and recognising the importance of images as distinct from, well, not distinct from facts. Well, they are distinct from facts because they have their own influences, images, and the manipulation of emotions as well, which I think the younger generation is more on top of maybe than the more senior members of the panel. Vinya and Letitia, thank you.
Just quickly to add to what has already been said about how to link the grassroots with the national and global levels, I think one important point is that the grassroots organizations or NGOs cannot continue to just drive the processes at grassroots level. We are innovating, but at some point, the state has to take the responsibility and run the services. And there had been very good examples where the NGO models have been replicated by the governments. That should be the aim. So we can, it's not just linking to global discussions, but also the alternative models, pressurizing the governments to take. And in Sri Lanka, for example, services related to gender-based violence had been exclusively delivered by the non-governmental organizations. But since about 4 years back, within the government hospital system, the healthcare delivery system, we have been able to introduce counseling as a partnership and other services. So I think we need to really press for that and look at all the innovative responses that have been worked out by NGOs to scale up at a policy level and be part of the government health delivery system. And where we have a niche, we need to really partner and be a complementary service provider rather than we continuously run depending on donor funding. That should change. That's my view on this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Letitia.
I'll be very quick, Stephanie. So firstly, just to say that it's a moral, economic, social, and political imperative for us to address equity or issues of inequity, to achieve equity, health equity, as well as social justice and human rights. So I want to both invite and plead with everyone in the audience to join forces with the World Federation to build a broad social movement that would actually begin to address one of the most critical issues that's going to face us in the next number of decades.
Thank you, and thank you. A few thank yous, and I really encourage you to come and speak with us during the afternoon tea or during the remainder of the meeting. I'm wanting to thank Peter on the visuals and Melissa on sound for your assistance. Particularly thank our friend and colleague Dr. David Legg for convening this opportunity for us to meet and talk and share our ideas and hopefully get a bit more excited about how to redress the imbalances and the inequities that Letitia's so eloquently highlighted. So please join me in thanking the panel members and the discussants.